Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome everybody today on Tuesday for our encore presentation of the cortisol awakening response and the thymocyte selection and unlikely duo in reducing autoimmunity. We did present this webinar last week. It was very popular. We did have a small glitch in recording it, so we thought, hey, why not? We had such a good response. We'll just run it again. And so anybody who missed it, I think you're in for a really great, fast, rapid hour of lecture from Dr. Jones. And for any of you who were with us last week, I think this is, it's going to be great to hear a lot of this information again. Barring no technical difficulties, we do plan to send the webinar out to all of you, plus anybody last week as well, tomorrow afternoon. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jones to give it a go, to give a start to this.
To get to our second go round.
Right.
Excellent. Well, welcome again, everybody. And for those of you who are new to this, welcome to this webinar. I will say the same sort of announcement that I said last time. There are a lot of slides, and last time we went a little bit over. We were about an hour and 15, an hour and 20. It's a lot of really cool information that I just want you to have about cortisol. Yes, it is about autoimmunity and thymocyte selection, but really, I really just want you to understand like the glucocorticoid receptor. We're going to talk about heat shock proteins. We're going to talk about the mitochondria. So everything kind of from the stress response down, what's going on. So let's just go ahead and jump in to our webinar. Autoimmune facts. Autoimmune disease affects approximately 8% of the population. Of those 8%, 78% are women. So we hear a lot about women and the tendency towards autoimmune. There are a lot of reasons for that, one of which is estradiol. There's a lot of good research on the shifting in estradiol, either in our cycle, into puberty, while pregnant, delivery, and then as we head into perimenopause and menopause and estrogen's effect on the immune system. We are, however, going to focus on cortisol, but if you have an interest, I highly recommend you PubMed whatever autoimmune you're looking up in estradiol, and you will find a lot of information. So the AARDA says there are over 100 autoimmune diseases, but the NIH says that there are only over 80. Regardless, that's a lot of autoimmune, and of course, there are likely a lot of autoimmune we don't know about yet. Treating autoimmunity is a multi-billion-dollar healthcare industry, and according to the NIH, autoimmunity is absolutely on the rise. And I think for those of you listening, you can agree that you are seeing a lot more autoimmunity in your practices. So like I said earlier, there are a lot of causes of autoimmune disease. I'm completely aware of that. What we are going to focus on sort of from the top all the way to the teeny tiny bottom of the mitochondria is just cortisol. I just want to give you a crash course in cortisol and autoimmunity so you have this in your toolbox. Quick facts on cortisol, if you're a little bit new, signaling starts in the brain. So the hypothalamus releases CRH, the pituitary releases ACTH, and the production starts and ends in the mitochondria of the zona fasciculata in the adrenal glands. Now I point this out because I had a comment on social media where I was talking about mitochondria and cortisol, and a very well-meaning commenter said, I wish you would get off the bandwagon of talking about mitochondria and not disregard the importance of the adrenal glands. And I thought, oh no, physiology at its teeniest, tiniest level in the adrenal glands, in the zona fasciculata, in the cell, in the mitochondria, that's where you start and stop with cortisol production. Signaling's in the brain, production's in the mitochondria. We're not disregarding the adrenal gland. We are strictly talking about the mitochondria deep down in there. So if you need a visual, stress happens, whether it's external stress, internal stress, perceived stress, actual stress, anticipated stress, your body reacts the same way. You release CRH to the pituitary, that releases ACTH, and then you release all your hormone. Now, ACTH does not trigger the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine. That is different signaling. But ACTH does help trigger development, creation, production of norepinephrine and epinephrine. When we look in on the adrenal gland, we have the cortex. The cortex is made up of the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. The fasciculata is really that thick. The production of cortisol really is the most important part of the adrenal gland. That's why it's such a big layer. Then we move down at the medulla. The medulla are where you make your catecholamines, your norepinephrine and epinephrine. We are going to focus only on cortisol though. So as we get down into the fasciculata, we get down into the cells of the fasciculata, we look at your mitochondria. So cholesterol is the backbone to all of your steroid hormones, including cortisol. Cholesterol has to get in there. What it does is it binds to something called a star protein, literally STAR, star protein. That converts itself into pregnenolone. Pregnenolone goes out into the endoplasmic reticulum, becomes 11-deoxycortisol, comes back in the mitochondria, that becomes cortisol. So this is what I mean when your cortisol production starts and ends in the mitochondria. Now the signaling is in the brain, but the production is way down here with like a teeny little like bump out into the endoplasmic reticulum. So it's important too, but mitochondrial health is critical. Quick facts, cortisol follows a circadian rhythm, starting with the cortisol awakening response, which is what we're going to focus on. Roughly 1 to 5% of free cortisol is active. That's what binds to receptors and does the things. The rest is bound tightly to cortisol binding globulin and loosely to albumin. Cortisol binding globulin is like any other binding globulin, sex hormone binding globulin, thyroid binding globulin. It is affected by things like insulin, estrogen, the birth control pill. So when we make some of these global statements about binding globulins, cortisol is in there as well. Cortisol binding globulin is also known as transcortin. So sometimes you'll see in labs transcortin, sometimes you'll see it listed as CBG. If it's not free or bound up, it's excreted as metabolized cortisol and metabolized cortisone. To make cortisone, though, we need a nifty little enzyme called 11-beta-HSD. So cortisol is active, cortisone is inactive. Your body is intelligent. Your body can flip it back and forth once you produce it. 11-beta-HSD1 activates. 1 is activate. Activates in the liver, your fat tissue, your gonads, your brain, your vascular smooth muscle. It inactivates in places where you have a lot of mineralocorticoid receptors. Kidneys, colon, salivary gland. So where you're trying to protect the mineralocorticoid receptors, that's where you tend to deactivate a lot. So it's possible that you're working with somebody who has low cortisol, but it's not a production problem. It's not a signaling problem. It's a deactivation problem. So this is why it's really helpful on testing to see what cortisone looks like as well. If you have more cortisone compared to cortisol, it's possible you have deactivation. So why might you have deactivation? What are common reasons? Just so you're aware. Well, long-term stress or illness causing high cortisol. And like I said, that high cortisol can bind to the mineralocorticoid receptors and displace aldosterone. Your body doesn't like that. And so it will upregulate the 11-beta-HSD2 to deactivate cortisone and protect your mineralocorticoid receptors. Doesn't always work the way we want, but the body is trying. After an acute illness or recovery, think about it. Let's say you've been sick and you're feeling well enough to get back to work again, but everything makes you tired. Going up the stairs makes you tired. Taking a shower makes you tired. By noon of your workday, you're tired. And it's because your body is actively deactivating you. Actively deactivating, you know what I mean? It's purposely deactivating you to protect you. It's to get you to slow down, to rest, and to heal. This is one of the mechanisms. There are other mechanisms, such as like the thyroid is involved. Same for recovery. If you've had surgery, then your body is trying to get you to recover. There is a mutation. It's not very common, but it is 11-beta-HSD2 upregulated mutation. But if you have somebody who is a deactivator on testing, you're like, oh my gosh, this person makes a lot of cortisone. Think either long-term stress or acute illness sort of first and foremost. Now, once you have cortisol, once the brain has said, let's make cortisol, and you've capped it as cortisol, it has to bind, right? It has to bind to a receptor and do the thing. It has to turn it on. This is stress we're talking about. So now it binds to the glucocorticoid receptor. This is where it should bind. This is its home. The mineralocorticoid receptor, it can, but the glucocorticoid receptor is its actual home. So the glucocorticoid receptor hangs out in the cytosol in a resting state with proteins. So the proteins are commonly known as heat shock protein 90 and heat shock protein 70. There are others, these are just heavily studied. So heat shock protein 90 and heat shock protein 70, they keep the glucocorticoid receptor what they call capable and ready to bind, like forever ready, right? Always ready. The receptor is like, I got you, cortisol. When you bind to me, I'm ready. So when cortisol, which is lipophilic, diffuses across the cell membrane, it binds to the glucocorticoid receptor. Now the heat shock proteins release, they've done their job. They need to go off and signal. And the cortisol glucocorticoid receptor moves into the nucleus, binds to something called a GRE, glucocorticoid response element. And that's how you do the thing. That's how you begin what's called gene transcription. So cortisol floats through, binds to the receptor. The heat shock proteins go off to do their thing and signal some more. You go to the nucleus, you do gene transcription. So you turn things on, whatever it is that cortisol is trying to turn on right there. So if you need a little like visual, here's your visual: cortisol coming through. It has the option to become cortisone if it's your body's protecting you. If not, you bind to the receptor. The little blue oval blobs bounce off. Those are your heat shock proteins. Everything goes to the nucleus, and now you make things happen. You handle the stress, or you make the blood sugar, or you dilate the eyes, or whatever it is you need to do. So this leads me to heat shock proteins. What's a heat shock protein? Well, heat shock proteins are chaperone proteins from the heat shock protein gene, appropriately enough. Their main role is to deal with protein folding in a lot of ways. So this is my favorite visual. For those of you who've ever tried to fold a fitted sheet, it often ends up looking on the left, when the heat shock protein, if you just had a heat shock protein, it would help you make the sheet look like on the right, all nice and folded. So an unfolded or misfolded protein contributes to pathology of many diseases. Here's what's really interesting that I read in a research study. When you have a protein and it's all nice and folded like that sheet, and it's floating in your cell or in your nucleus or wherever it is, you have a lot of things in your cell. It's not empty. It's not spacious. They are not keeping 6 feet apart. So your protein is bumping into amino acids and mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum and vacuoles and all these things. And when it bumps into them, it alters the shape of the protein. So the heat shock protein makes sure you get yourself, like a chiropractor, it like pushes you back into place so that you can maintain the fold you were supposed to maintain. Otherwise, if you get incorrect folding on the left, you end up potentially with pathology. So we like our heat shock proteins. They stabilize and activate over 200 proteins, including some common ones you're familiar with: NF-kappa beta, JAK-STAT, tumor suppressor P53, FOXO, and MAPK. So like some really common big players in the human body. They protect against heat stress, which is what they're named after, cold thermogenesis, UV light, wound healing, inflammation, alcohol, metals, metal exposure, starvation, hypoxia, external stressors, and more. So they really are important to the protection of our proteins. They do help with protein degradation. So when your protein is dysfunctional and busted up and just not going to look like that nice, neat folded sheet anymore, it's got to go. And so the heat shock proteins help with that. It does have a high affinity ATP binding site. So when your heat shock protein is not interacting, it's in an ATP bound state. This means your ATP levels in your body are really important for your heat shock proteins. Where do you make your ATP? Oh, right, in your mitochondria. Mitochondria are really important, and we do go into mitochondria quite a bit as we get into the treatment section. So one, you make your cortisol in the mitochondria, but you also need that ATP made by the mitochondria to support your heat shock proteins. So let's focus on just 90 and 70, heat shock 90 and heat shock 70 quickly, so you have an idea of the difference between them. You're going to probably see heat shock proteins talked a lot more in functional health education and webinars, just because there's some really cool data and cool research on them, especially as it relates to cortisol. And given this year, heat shock proteins working to our benefit are really helpful right now. So heat shock protein 90 activates both the innate and adaptive immune system, and it can act as the damp. If you remember your damps and pamps, Your damp is a damage that's been done from internally. So like a cell broke apart and all the like busted pieces fall out. Damage associated molecular pattern due to cellular damage. A PAMP is external. A PAMP is like something that's not of yourself that is coming in and causing protein associated molecular damage. It's something else that's coming at you. Your heat shock protein 90 does increase NF-kappa beta, so it can be inflammatory. You need it for proper binding of glucocorticoids, but also aldosterone and the mineral corticoid receptors, estrogen receptors, progesterone receptors, androgen receptors. Unfortunately, a dysfunctional heat shock protein 90 can lead to carcinogenesis, autoimmune development, chronic disease, and right now they're studying inhibitors for cancer treatment to reduce autoimmune flares and rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, uveitis, colitis, alcoholic liver injury, and lung inflammation. And again, it's not that heat shock protein 90 is bad inherently, right? Nothing's bad inherently, but it's like Goldilocks. So too much is a problem and too little is a problem. We need just right, and we need to know when to turn them on and off. That's the bigger issue. Heat shock protein 70 is generally associated with suppressing pro-inflammatory genes. So it's anti-inflammatory. It blocks transcription for NF-kappa beta. Now, pros and cons, right? Like sometimes we need a little inflammation, but then we need to know when to turn it off. It activates the anti-inflammatory cascade. It increases those Treg cells, so that's good. And in animal studies, inducing heat shock protein 70 downregulates autoimmune arthritis development. They also found that a high expression of this heat shock protein allows cells to survive injuries that are lethal under normal conditions. And that sentence right there is like really striking to me. This heat shock protein can allow you to survive injuries that are lethal under normal conditions. It's almost like cool X-Men stuff, right? But if you are really damaged, do you really want that cell or that thing, that protein, to stay alive? So it's a balance. We want to be able to be resilient and bounce back, but we don't want to be so broken that the body's like just trying to hang on. Like, no, I can duct tape it. I can duct tape it and make it work. We don't want to duct tape it. We want to be able to fix it, right? Heal it, reduce inflammation, and all in a balance. Duct tape's good to a degree, right? But not for everything in our body. So that leads us to testing. How do we test cortisol? So we've talked about signaling in the brain. We've talked about cortisol versus cortisone. Now we know cortisol binds to the glucocorticoid receptor. The glucocorticoid receptor needs heat shock proteins. We talked about the two different main heat shock proteins. There are others, but those are big ones. And now we want to test cortisol. So because this is a Dutch webinar, we're going to have a couple slides on Dutch before we move on. So testing cortisol. On the Dutch test, Dutch stands for dried urine test for comprehensive hormones. We do have a combination of dried urine by itself or dried urine with saliva swabs, which are for the cortisol awakening response. One of the big bonuses of urine is that you get the metabolites that come out the other end. So you can see not only the estrogen, but the estrogen metabolites. You can see testosterone, the testosterone metabolites. We give you some additional information such as that metabolized cortisol I talked about in the earlier beginning slide. Organic acids such as the ones for B6, B12, glutathione. We do look at HVA and VMA for dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine metabolite. We do an 8-OHDG test, which is an oxidative stress marker. We do look at melatonin, and for women who need it, we also have the option where she can collect a urine every morning of her cycle, almost every morning of her cycle, and evaluate estrogen and progesterone throughout. This is what the collection looks like if you are new to Dutch test. This is the strip that you or the patient would urinate on. And if you add in the cortisol awakening response, you have the option of saliva swab versus saliva tube. There are different labs out there that use different ones for different reasons. So the tube on the right, you do have to spit or passively drool into the tube. Depending how big or how long it takes you, how big the tube is or how long it takes you to fill up the tube, that could be a problem with collecting an appropriate cortisol awakening response because timing is everything. Some labs do advise you to rinse out your mouth with water prior to collection, which is tough when you're doing the cortisol awakening response because again, timing is everything and you don't want to rinse, wait, resalivate, and then start the collection in the tube. You have the option for the salivate swabs on the left. It's basically a cotton swab. You pop it into your mouth, get it wet, pop it back into the tube. So you get a truer, timed cortisol awakening response. You don't have to spit. There is no passive drool. It's great for those who have dry mouth. And the swab is generally what's used in research. And so as a result, Dutch has chosen to use the swabs because passive drooling just takes a lot of time and can be really challenging for some people, especially the dry mouth people, first thing in the morning. So research regarding dried urine. Yes, in 2019, a study was published in BMC that looked at estradiol and progesterone comparing dried urine version versus serum version and found that the results were comparable. So there is the graph there looking at the two. So progesterone on the top, estradiol on the bottom between serum and dried urine. And cross fingers, pending publication this year, 2020, did a study comparing dried urine to salivary cortisol results. The ending was there's statistical equivalence between the rise and fall in saliva and the rise in urine for free cortisol throughout the day. Now you may ask yourself, well, why is it offset? Why does saliva, the dotted line, and urine, the solid line, not line up with each other like they should? Great question, because we're looking at cortisol here. On urine, there is a delay because when you make cortisol, it has to go through the kidneys and into the bladder and then out. Whereas saliva, when you suck on the cotton swab or spit into the tube of other labs, you get the cortisol, basically kind of what's happening right there in the moment, or at least what's up in the gums. And so it is offset by about an hour or two when you're looking, but the pattern is what lines up and is statistically equivalent. So choosing the right test on Dutch, the Dutch Complete is an all urine all the time. So we do look at all the sex hormones and metabolites, cortisol, cortisone, melatonin, 8-OHDG, that oxidative stress marker, the nutritional like B6, B12, glutathione, and neurotransmitter metabolites. For the purpose of this webinar, though, we are going to focus on the cortisol awakening response as it relates to autoimmunity and just cortisol in general. This is the Dutch Plus. The Dutch Plus is a combination of all the urine strips with the addition of the cortisol salivary swabs done 3 times in the morning, around dinner, and before bed. So this one is more comprehensive collection, giving you more data points, specifically around cortisol. So this is the one we're going to focus on, and it still gives you all the same things, all the metabolites of your estrogen. It still gives you melatonin. It still gives you the organic acids. You're still getting DHEA and all that, absolutely, but you just get the extra addition of those cortisol markers. So we're looking, most of you are familiar with the grand sweeping cortisol 4-point through the day. So we have waking, a couple hours later, some labs are around lunch, in the afternoon or around dinner, and at night before bed. And what we've done now is introduce the cortisol awakening response, which is a little different. The cortisol awakening response is a marker that's being used to determine resilience and flexibility. And I swear, if 2020 had a word, it's resilience. You hear it everywhere, resiliency. And if it's not resilience, it's pivot. We hear pivot all the time too. But resiliency is probably the big one. So it has been repeatedly suggested that the CAR could be a result of the anticipated demands of the upcoming day and could support coping with daily stress. And I think all of us know that the world right now is coping with daily life stress more than ever. So what does the CAR influence? What does this cortisol awakening response even mean? So the CAR itself is not just your cortisol through the day, but it's a specific time in the morning or a specific way in the morning that your cortisol increases naturally. And that increase influences things like your alertness, your energy levels, your resilience, your level of feeling stressed out. It handles your blood sugar management because cortisol and norepinephrine, epinephrine are part of your glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. So if you have cortisol problems in the morning, you're probably going to struggle with blood sugar stuff in the morning. Autoimmune development and progression, which we're going to talk about. Inflammation regulation. How many of your patients say to you, I wake up in the morning in pain, my joints hurt, but after about 20 or 30 minutes of moving around, they feel a lot better. It's because your cortisol has gone up. This natural increase in cortisol, first thing, is reducing inflammation. Infection regulation. Same thing. How many people say, you know, I woke up this morning, I thought maybe I was getting sick, but once I got up and got moving, turns out I don't think I am getting sick. I actually feel a lot better. That initial rise in cortisol first thing is helping to put a damper on fighting or on inflammation, right? And therefore is affecting your immune system so that you can fight whatever it is you need to fight. Memory and recall. That rise in cortisol really helps to remember things you have learned the day before and sets it in the hippocampus, so to speak. So tomorrow, if you're thinking to yourself, what was it that Carrie said about this whole webinar? You probably have a cortisol awakening response issue. And lastly, are cancer outcomes. So the steepness or flatness of your cortisol curve in the day affects mortality, especially with breast cancer and prostate cancer. So we want a nice, normal, healthy cortisol rise in the morning for those who have breast cancer or prostate cancer. If their slope is flatter, more of a flat straight line, then they do have an earlier mortality, and we definitely don't want that. So I've been talking a lot about this car. How does it even work? What am I looking for? What makes it different from cortisol throughout the day? Here's the thing. When you are getting closer to waking up in the morning, internally, your body knows you're going to wake up. Your brain is signaling to your adrenals, can we go now? Can I make cortisol now? And the adrenals go, no, we have a blunting. Like, no, their eyes aren't open yet. There's no light involved, not yet. As you become conscious, as you wake up and open your eyes, the blunting gets removed. Everything happens, CRH, ACTH, cortisol production, and the production is very fast. You get at least a 50% increase over baseline in the first 30 minutes. It's very rapid, and it's normal. It's normal for your cortisol to go up that quickly, that steeply, that early in the morning. And it helps move you from conscious to alert, and then you get a recover period as cortisol starts to decline down through the rest of the day so that you can fall asleep and stay asleep. So when we talk about cortisol in the morning and cortisol in the circadian rhythm, we're really talking about the first 30 to 45 minutes of you waking up. That's the magic window. That's when the magic happens. So when we're collecting cortisol, when I'm talking about the Dutch Plus or I'm talking about cortisol awakening response, the collection is immediately on waking, 30 minutes after waking, because I need to see how steep you get up there with your cortisol. Can you do it? And then 60 minutes after that, do you still go up? Do you gradually fall back down? Have you been flatlining this whole time? Maybe, unfortunately, you go straight down the whole time. And then we collect around dinner and before bed. And if you have insomnia, you'll collect in the middle of the night. So we want to make sure, let me go back. I'm going to want to make sure that we get a full picture of your cortisol through the day. We focus on the morning. I want to know in 30 minutes, can you do it? Are you right? Like, can you get your cortisol up there? And then do you recover and then your cortisol goes down through the rest of the day? That is the cortisol awakening response. The real question is, can you make the switch? Can you go from consciousness, like, yep, I'm awake. I don't want to be awake, but I am awake, all the way to alertness in about 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. So I ask this question all the time when I'm talking about cortisol. How long does it take you to become alert and ready in the morning? And if you say to me, Carrie, it takes me about 2 hours and 2 cups of coffee, then I know you have a cortisol awakening response issue. And same thing, how long does it take for your joint pain in the morning when you feel kind of like creaky and achy? Does that ever go away? And if you're like, after a couple hours, after some movement, obviously there are a lot of reasons for joint pain. But if you say it used to go away in about 20 or 30 minutes and now it's not, cortisol awakening response plays a role. On the flip side, if you tell me you wake up with anxiety, you wake up with panic, you wake up and you immediately are hypervigilant, you're fearful, you're a 10 out of 10, then your cortisol awakening response is too high, right? It's responding to the stress that's going to happen that day or the anticipated stress for the day. It's an over response. And so we want to know, are you an over or an under when it comes to your cortisol awakening response? We really just kind of want to be Goldilocks and have it just right. So the whole curve looks like this. And you might think, well, that's normally what the cortisol curve looks like. It's up and then it comes down through the rest of the day. This is focused in the first 30 to 60 minutes of the morning. So keep that in mind. This isn't in the morning and this isn't at lunch. This isn't in the morning, a couple hours later. This is in the morning on waking, 30 minutes later, and 30 minutes after that. So we're very zoomed in here. We've got a microscope right up to your pattern to see what you're doing. And it should look like this. So you should have a nice peaked mountain on your cortisol and then go down from there. So let's talk about autoimmune and this rise in the morning, this cortisol awakening response. And we're going to talk about it as relates to the thymus gland. So not thyroid, which is in your neck, but thymus, which is behind your breastbone here, your sternum. So sometimes you'll see, like if people are getting sick or they're trying to, quote, stimulate their immune system, you'll see them start to tap and to knock and to pound and to stimulate and to do lymphatic work over their chest bone. And what they're trying to do is talk to their thymus gland. They're trying to get their thymus gland to wake up and like, hey, I need your help here. Let's do this. So the thymus gland is a very smart gland. Your body is very smart. And what happens is this quote, glucocorticoids are strong inducers of apoptosis in the thymocytes. What does that mean? You're a T cell. You are a new baby T cell. You're a T cell in your thymus gland right now. And what happens is T cells are immature and they're double negative, CD4 negative, CD8 negative. And as they move through differentiation in your thymus gland, as they go from like pre-K, up to like 5th grade, they differentiate to double positive. So CD4 positive, CD8 positive. But you can't have that. You have to be one or the other. Unfortunately, most people fail out of 5th grade here in the thymus gland, and most of those cells die through apoptosis, just right, natural cell death, natural atresia. But the ones that graduate on and move into 6th grade and then 7th grade and 8th grade and on into high school, they have to go through something called central tolerance. And so basically your thymus gland runs proteins by the T cell to see if you're going to react to it. And those are basically parts of tissue from your body. So are you going to react to thyroid? Are you going to react to hair follicle? Are you going to react to epidermis? Are you going to react to, whatever, right? It doesn't matter. The ovarian tissue, granulosa cells, like, are you going to react? And if you react, if you don't react, if you pass, if you graduate now from high school, then you become a single positive, so CD4 positive or CD8 positive, and you are allowed out in circulation. So this is what you want. You don't want to react to anything. Don't react, don't react, don't react. Go out into circulation and fight the bad things. But if you do react, if you attack the thyroid tissue, so to speak, if you attacked the epidermis protein, so to speak, then you fail. And now you have to die because the body's like, oh, dang it, you cannot be, a high school cell that's going to go out and attack all the thyroid tissue. That just leads to things like Hashimoto's. We can't have that. So in my head, it pulls the cells aside, the T cells that have failed central tolerance, and they have to die. And they get killed by this thing called AIRE. But a big trigger is the rise in cortisol in the morning. So the rise in cortisol triggers this, turns this on, so these cells that have failed central tolerance can die. If you don't have a healthy cortisol awakening response, if you go down or you're flatlined, then you may struggle more with autoimmune, either progression or development. And so you may have people who say, gosh, I thought my autoimmune symptoms were under control, but now they're so much worse. And I'm also so tired in the morning. I need a lot more caffeine. I'm hitting snooze more. I can't get out of bed. Know that those two things are correlated. They're not the only thing in the body, but they are a big thing. You can absolutely look this up too. So glucocorticoids are strong inducers of apoptosis in the thymocytes. We want a healthy CAR in the morning, a healthy cortisol rise, so that we can minimize our risk for T cells in our thymus gland that are accidentally created autoimmune. So what is this autoimmune regulator gene, the AIRE? So it encodes for protein that acts in the thymus gland. And when those T cells fail central tolerance, the AIRE destroys the T cells with the help of cortisol. So they work together, they work in tandem. As a little side note, unfortunately, females, we kind of got the short end of the stick here. Females experience a decrease in the air at puberty compared to males. And human and mouse studies show that estradiol, specifically like elevated estradiol, exogenous, above physiologic estradiol, downregulates it. And so estrogen, estradiol in particular, plays a big role in the immune system as it relates to T and B cells, but we lose out on, this is one of the reasons estrogen, females, autoimmunity kind of go hand in hand. So what we want to try to do, women, is we want to try to make up for this deficit by making sure our cortisol in the morning is healthy. We don't want it, it's like Goldilocks, not too low and not too high, but healthy enough that we can activate the autoimmune regulator gene. So if you're new to the thymus gland, smart but sensitive, unfortunately. So the thymus and its microenvironment changes throughout life under influence of many different types of intrinsic and extrinsic factors, including all of those things. And you can recognize all of those things in your daily life right now. And so it's really important that we do what we can and support our cortisol, and just be mindful of all the lifestyle stuff, knowing that it's all going to affect our thymus gland. I mean, it affects everything, but really, I mean, when you read this quote, you're like, oh, I need to really protect my thymus gland back here behind my chest bone. So the take home message is, if you have a low or flat CAR, your risk for autoimmune increases because the failed cells, those failed T cells, aren't killed. We want to get that cortisol up there to support the autoimmune regulator gene killing those cells. So here's an example of a woman in her 40s. She has fatigue, especially in the morning. She requires 2 to 4 cups of coffee to feel alert and ready. She has sleep apnea, but she does not use her sleep apnea machine. She does have Hashimoto's, and her antibodies have greatly increased, and she feels more thyroid symptoms. And you know what I mean by that, right? Most patients come in and they're like, my symptoms are all back, and it feels thyroid. It's those symptoms are back. So you can see, if we zoom in here, that she's supposed to be in the gray area. She is the blue line, and we circle in red how she kind of flat lines in the morning. So you can see why it takes her a while to get going, 2 to 4 cups of coffee in a couple of hours, and maybe why her thyroid symptoms are back and her antibodies are going up. So why would somebody have low cortisol? Why would somebody have low cortisol awakening response in the morning? Several of the things we've talked about. So there's a negative feedback. I spelled loop wrong. Oh, and I forgot to correct it. I even recognized it in the first webinar, and I forgot to correct it in the second webinar. Dang it. Well, negative feedback loop to the brain. So when you have a lot of high stress over time, the brain says, wow, it's a lot of stress. This is a lot of cortisol. I'm going to protect myself, and I'm going to inhibit CRH and ACTH and gradually shush the cortisol. Like we're good now. We don't need that much cortisol, please. Unfortunately, though, humans feel this, is that they were high cortisol and now they're low cortisol, and they are tired and they're burnt out and exhausted and relying on a lot of caffeine to push and keep going. Poor HPA communication. We talked about how the brain is so critical, so we're going to talk about that. Mitochondrial dysfunction. Maybe you have great communication, but your mitochondria get taken a bruising, and so now you can't produce cortisol. Receptor binding issues, heat shock protein binding issues. You look like that busted up folded sheet as opposed to the normal, healthy, flat folded sheet. Excessive amounts of psychological burnout, which is oh so common in 2020. Sleep deprivation, sleep apnea, disordered breathing, mouth breathing. She is guilty of this, sleep apnea that she's not controlling. Traumatic brain injury, anything that shakes, rattles, bruises the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, or the pituitary will affect how we make cortisol, any hormone for that matter. Chronic pain, chronic inflammation, chronic infection, whether it's stealth or overt, can eventually lead to HPA downregulation. You did have high cortisol, you're getting shushed over time, and your cortisol drops low. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So the further away the PTSD is, we tend to find a lower CAR compared to sort of the normal controls, as opposed to somebody who had the experience and really pretty recently. Seasonal affective disorder, fluorescent light exposure all day long, and suppressive medications. Suppressive medications are things like opioids, and it doesn't take much. Somebody's taking, popping a few opioids a couple times a week for their back pain, that can do it. Steroid medications, this time, steroid inhalers, steroid nasal sprays. Maybe they're doing some sort of steroid prescription cream for something. Joint injection, they had joint injection in their shoulder, in their knee. All of those steroids can, to a varying degree, depending on dose and length of time, suppress the HPA axis. So let's improve a low cortisol awakening response. So first things first, makes total sense. You're going to address whatever the cause is as best you can. You're going to start with the brain, because from the very beginning of this webinar, we talked about brain signaling and brain health and how that's where it all kicks off. And we're going to focus on HPA retraining, which is starting with the brain, moving to the mitochondria, and using light is light and dark is our guiding forces. So basically like uppers in the morning and downers at night, but like healthy kind, you know what I mean? We're going to use adaptogens and nutrients and brain support to our advantage. Light therapy, like I said, which I'll explain, and light movement or light exercise on waking. We're just trying to stimulate the HPA axis. So what happens when you've lost your rhythm? What do I mean by the circadian rhythm? So it turns out you have a clock gene. The clock genes are in your suprachiasmatic nucleus in your hypothalamus, and they are known as your central pacemaker. They literally keep your time in your body of when things should happen. They coordinate all overt bodily rhythms through multiple outputs. This is everything from when you wake up, when you go to sleep, when you make glucose, when you are hungry, when you get your period. All of these things are essentially coordinated by the clock genes, the central pacemaker. They utilize light and dark cues to resync what are known as their oscillators every single day. The thing about these clock genes is that your body is not exactly 24 hours. Military time is 24 hours. The clock on, on your Apple Watch is 24 hours. The clock on your wall is 24 hours. Although actually it may be 12 and just goes around twice, but you know what I mean? It's 24 hours for our human life, but it's not how our body works. It's actually a little over 24 hours. It's how we were designed. So every single day we have to get knocked back to the 24-hour mark, and it's done through entrainment. And the main central cue of the clock is light. The main external cue is light in the morning. That helps get you, that entrains you, right? That entrains you. It's the main cue. So you will see that I didn't say take ashwagandha, and you will see that I didn't say do intermittent fasting, and you will see that I didn't say like, oh yeah, you need to do HIIT training first thing on waking. While those things may or may not be helpful, what I said was light. So give the clock gene what it wants. Get sun or full spectrum light exposure first thing on waking. Open your blinds, open your curtains, buy a full spectrum light, turn it on, buy a full spectrum alarm clock, and wake up that way in the morning. Now at night, we need darkness. So darkness resets. Light entrains, darkness resets. And again, I didn't say, Tulsi, holy basil. And I didn't say chamomile, and I didn't say a hot bath. And while all those things are helpful, what I said is darkness. Darkness is what resets a dysfunctional clock gene. So give the clock gene what it wants. And we know darkness increases melatonin production and it decreases cortisol production. So we want light in the morning or whenever you need to get up for the day. And I mean that specifically around our night shift workers. We love our night shift workers, but our night shift workers struggle because they are getting up and going to work when the rest of us are winding down. So a night shift worker will set their light and their darkness opposite of a day shift worker. We just do the best we can with our night shift workers. If you go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, don't turn on the light. That white, bright light can affect your cortisol and melatonin. Not for everyone, of course, but if somebody struggles with sleep and they find that they're getting up and going to the bathroom multiple times a night, one, that disrupts their sleep, but two, that constant light exposure could really affect their entrainment and their resetment. So just keep that in mind. Go for a dim light, go for, a red light, go for a salt lamp, go for something else. Whatever you do in the morning, do it within 30 minutes of waking if you can. So the cortisol awakening response has 30 minutes to kick off. So we want to be right there ready to support it with whatever supplement you're going to give them, light exposure, light movement, whatever it is. When it comes to supplements, I fully realize the caveat is those taking thyroid medication. We know the thyroid medication is a diva. She likes to be the only thing in your stomach for a good solid hour. And she does not play well with minerals, right? She doesn't like magnesium, and she doesn't like iron, and she doesn't like calcium, and she doesn't like phytates. She doesn't like dairy products. Like she's real particular on who can play well with her when in the stomach. So if somebody's on thyroid in the morning, just have them take their morning supplements, after their thyroid medication when it's safe. you don't have to force the issue there. So that is the one caveat. If they're not on thyroid medication, or if they take their thyroid medication at night, if they get up at 4 in the morning and take their thyroid and go back to sleep, then they can do their morning supplements on waking. And of course, always address their sleep. So it starts with the brain. We want to follow a strict circadian rhythm. We want to get that gut health happy. We want to work on the vagus nerve, since we know the vagus nerve predominantly sends signals up to the brain. We want to improve blood flow and oxygenation to the brain. So exercising, stopping smoking, normalize blood sugar, body work, neurofeedback, biotuning, cranial sacral, energy work, acupuncture, chiropractic, massage, lymphatic, whatever it takes. If somebody's struggling, remember, oxygenation is critical. It's also critical for your mitochondria. Oxygenation, clearly, because we're human. And two, our hormones travel around on our circulatory system. So if you even make an ACTH, but you have a lot of, your shoulders are up at your ears and your posture is messed up and your muscles are tight, and you're struggling with blood flow and circulation, you're going to struggle to get that ACTH around. So right now, listening to this webinar, I want you to straighten up your posture. I want you to pull your shoulders down out of your ears. I want you to pull your chin back. If you're looking down at your phone because you're distracted right now, you now have forward head posture. Pull your head up, please, and take a deep breath, and that will really help. And do that routinely throughout the day, and you will realize how poor your posture actually is all day long. Hyperbaric and oxygen therapy. Get that oxygen, especially for those who've had a post-traumatic brain injury. Love HBOT. Test for iron overload, hemochromatosis because of the iron deposits in the brain. Reducing EMF and cell phone exposure to the head. Make sure they're assessing for snoring, sleep apnea, disordered or mouth breathing. We really want oxygenation. We don't want to put them in a hypoxic state or pseudo-hypoxic state at all. We want somebody to have, amazing oxygen through their whole body. It only makes sense for human. Then we want to look at supplements for the brain. Bacopa. Bacopa is huge for reducing brain inflammation, improving cognition, good for ADD, ADHD. Raises BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We like BDNF. BDNF helps cells in the brain, helps with synapses. Cordyceps, omega-3 fatty acids, rosemary. Rosemary has cognitive enhancing powers. So for those of us in the United States listening to this webinar on Thursday is Thanksgiving, if you choose to celebrate, make sure you use rosemary in your dishes and you will have cognitive enhancing powers. The downside to rosemary, it will suppress iron absorption from the gut. So please don't swallow your iron supplements with your rosemary tea. Ginkgo, a lot of stuff on ginkgo, recall, recognition, reaction time, also increases BDNF. PQQ often is paired with CoQ10 for the mitochondria. It's a heck of an antioxidant for peroxynitrite, so improves mitochondrial health. It does reduce C-reactive protein and IL-6. And then brain glandulars. There are companies out there that, much like adrenal cortex or thyroid glandular, they do have brain glandulars as well. There is very little to no research at all on glandulars. I tend to use them quite a bit with my really depleted patients with a lot of success, but it's up to you. HPA general support, quality multivitamin might be a good start, especially if finances are an issue and they can't afford a lot of extra. With the B vitamins, we like that B5, that pantothenic acid, really important for the whole adrenal cortisol production program. Vitamin B6. Vitamin C for a lot of reasons right now. Humans cannot make their own vitamin C. I say this all the time. It would be really helpful if humans can make their own vitamin C right now. That'd be great if we could turn that switch on. I don't know why we can't make our own vitamin C. I don't know why other animals and mammals and what have you can make their own vitamin C in times of extreme stress, because now would be good. So please remember to divide it up into smaller amounts throughout the day for better absorption. It is an antioxidant in the adrenal gland, in the mitochondria with the production of cortisol. Magnesium. Raises BDNF, used in over 600 enzymatic reactions. Remember, with magnesium, it's all magnesium. It's the second word that is what does the extra bonus. So magnesium threonate, that threonate pushes the magnesium across the blood-brain barrier, gets it into the brain. Magnesium malate, the malate part is good for the muscle. Magnesium glycinate, glycinate is glycine, good for relaxation. So it's all magnesium, it's just what do you need it to do, right? Oxide really relieves constipation. And then essential fatty acids again. Adaptogens, we have ashwagandha, With the BDNF and the question mark, it's just that there's not a lot of literature behind it. So some of these things like Bacopa and ginkgo have stronger literature references, whereas ashwagandha is just not as strong in the literature. It doesn't mean it can't, it's just the backing behind it. With ashwagandha, you want to be careful. It can be a thyroid stimulant. You want to be wary with those with Graves, since we're talking autoimmune. Eleutherococcus, which is Siberian ginseng, great general tonic, does increase heat shock protein 70. Rhodiola also increases heat shock protein 70, increases SIRT1, which is one of your sirtuins. Rhodiola can be stimulating for some people. Be very careful. It's dose dependent. Be careful if it's later in the day for those folks. And rhodiola could be drying for some people. Good for those women with night sweats. Bad if she has dry eyes, dry mouth, and dry vagina. It can make her drier. Cordyceps. Cordyceps improves stamina, physical health, contains the beta glucans for immune support. We have Shishandra, which also increases heat shock protein 70, increases glutathione. And TCM, which is traditional Chinese medicine, Shishandra is great for that liver heat anger person. And so I use Shishandra a lot in that like really angry woman who like with PMS, when she's not weepy, but she's like heatedly angry. Shishandra often was part of my blend. Bacopa again is an adaptogen. Panax. Panax comes as a red or white form. It does take a couple weeks. I believe I've read multiple times, 6 weeks at least, 6 to 8 weeks to really kick in and notice a difference. It does raise BDNF. It could decrease glucose, which is a great thing if you are higher in glucose, but be careful if you tend towards hypoglycemia. And then licorice. Licorice does inhibit that 11 beta HSD2. So licorice keeps cortisol around longer. So if it's a deactivation problem, licorice is your friend. Just be careful, licorice does raise blood pressure and can reduce potassium over time, hypokalemia. So dose is everything. A lot of herbalists will say that they like licorice because licorice helps the other herbs play well. So like 50 to 100 milligrams may be nice in a blend. If you're really trying to hit somebody over the head, trying to keep their cortisol around longer, then you're looking at like the 300 to 600 range, but that will definitely affect blood pressure and potassium. So keep an eye on your patient as always. Speaking of heat shock protein 70, what are the things that help support your heat shock protein 70? So honestly, the first thing, dark chocolate, is really all you need to know. We could have just left it at that and called it good. But you'll see a lot of things you recognize. Some we've already talked about, you know, some that are really common, like broccoli sprout sulforaphane, multitask, curcumin, multitask, sauna, of course, because, you know, sauna heat shock protein does its job. Eleuthero, we talked about, allicin, whey protein, red wine. So I read that Syrah red wine increases heat shock protein 70, whereas Cabernet Franc has the highest amount of resveratrol in it, and resveratrol raises heat shock protein 70. Please be aware, though, it's still alcohol, even your biodynamic, organic, small batch wine. I know, I get it, I love it. It's still alcohol. So if you're still having liver processing issues, if you're having estrogen detoxification issues, maybe alcohol is not your best bet. Don't justify your Syrah habit because I said it could increase heat shock protein 70 in cell and animal studies. All right. What about your mitochondria, your lovely, lovely mitochondria? We all learned in school they are energy powerhouses, right? Our cellular powerhouses. They give us all the energy to power up all the reactions in our body. So, quick facts, it comes from your mom. In very rare cases, they have found paternal mitochondria, but it's like 99.9% maternal. It has its own genome, so your mitochondrial DNA. Unfortunately, your mitochondrial DNA is very sensitive. It's very susceptible to damage and doesn't have the histones to protect it from damage. There's a lot of reactive oxygen species that are formed in the mitochondria and the production of ATP. It's like you've got to trade the good for with some bad. So to make ATP, you have to make a lot of ROSs. And so if you don't have a lot of antioxidants to mop that up, then your mitochondrial DNA are at risk. There's limited DNA repair systems that are in there. So your BER, your base excision repair system, is not really down in the mitochondria. And obviously there's a lot of other reasons. So we have to be very careful for our mitochondria because their DNA is sensitive. It's sensitive. We know mitochondria makes ATP. It transiently stores calcium. So does the endoplasmic reticulum. It makes cortisol. And it's the first step to all your sex hormone production. And it plays a huge role in things like immune signaling, heme synthesis reactions, apoptosis signaling, membrane potential regulation of the cell, cellular metabolism, and more. So your mitochondria are pretty amazing. Primary or secondary disease. We're going to focus on the secondary part. So secondary mitochondrial dysfunction from environmental factors, meaning all the environment, not just like outdoor in the trees, but I mean like everything externally, and other genetic disorders. So diseases that are commonly associated with, not necessarily due to, but commonly associated with mitochondrial dysfunction are common: dementia, Alzheimer's, myopathy, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, endocrinopathies, which is what we're testing for, hormone dysfunction, schizophrenia, bipolar, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, a lot of eye issues. And then there's the free radical theory of aging due to the reactive oxygen species in mitochondria, which is essentially saying in women is we, and men too, but women it's a little easier to explain. As we lose our follicles, because we're heading closer to perimenopause and menopause, if our reactive oxygen species production outpaces our antioxidant ability, then we have more and more and more dysfunctional mitochondria, and we age faster. And specifically when this is happening right in the follicles of the ovaries. And so we could actually accelerate aging and accelerate our transition, or worsen even our transition from perimenopause into menopause. So mitochondrial health is really important during these transition times. Same for men and testosterone production. So given the multiple first-rate job that mitochondria do in the nervous system, it's hardly accidental that their malfunctioning has been associated with virtually every mental neurological affliction on Earth, including chronic psychological stress, fatigue, cognitive deficits, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, autism, multiple sclerosis, and Down syndrome. So I'm not saying mitochondria are causing these things per se, but it's been associated with, according to this 2018 study. We cannot forget about our mitochondria. So ATP, how do we generate ATP? So if you recall way back, playback to biochemistry, we have the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is part of it, NADH and FADH2. Those go over to the electron transport chain and help drive ATP synthesis. So here's a little visual. Here's our citric acid cycle that goes round and round, where acetyl-CoA comes in. And you will see on the the right-hand side, your methylmalonyl-CoA on the right. This is where adenosyl B12 comes into play. On the Dutch test, we're looking at the marker MMA, methylmalonate or methylmalonic acid. This is part of the citric acid or Krebs cycle, same thing. So if you have issues with your MMA on your Dutch test, you're going to have issues with adenosyl B12 and this Krebs cycle. This is your electron transport chain. So here's where your NADH comes in. Here's where your FADH comes in for your complex 1 and your complex 2. So you can make ATP. So what do we do when it comes to our mitochondria? So what screws up your mitochondria, we have to avoid. We know chemicals, toxins, pesticides, herbicides, mycotoxins, and mold. Viruses like Epstein-Barr, HIV, and this current one have been studied to screw up the mitochondria. Parasites, heavy metals, crappy Western diets that don't give you a lot of nutrients or antioxidants, certain medications, which I'll show you, ongoing inflammation and oxidative stress, alcohol, even the organic biodynamic type. You can tell I get asked that question a lot, so I just go ahead and put it in my slides. But Carrie, I drink a low sugar, organic, biodynamic, small batch form of wine. I get it. It's probably Syrah for your heat shock protein 70. Totally get it. Still alcohol. Copper toxicity, lack of antioxidants, lack of oxygen, lack of iron, or lack of glucose. All of these will mess up your mitochondria. So let's talk about environmental exposure. Several lines of evidence suggest that environmental exposures cause substantial mitochondrial dysfunction. I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but if you need a study to back you up, here is one. Mycotoxins. So mold and mycotoxins exert a multi-edged sword-like effect in test systems, causing mitochondrial dysfunction. Again, probably not a surprise that mold and mycotoxins, which are nasty, they produce nasty effects in the human body, can really affect through our mitochondria. Unfortunately, mold and mycotoxins can be anywhere: grains, dried fruits, nuts, coffee, and spices. The grains include the grains we eat as humans and the grains that are fed to animals. So this is why, if you can afford it and have access to it, grass-fed, grass-finished meat is ideal, because if the cow, as an example, is fed moldy grain, then there are studies to show that that could potentially transfer the mycotoxin part through into the meat. And so we want to reduce that risk as much as possible, if that's what happens for some people. Coffee, I am so sorry to say this, ochratoxin A, in these studies, they found between 26.6% and practically all samples, 91.7%, were contaminated with molds. I get pushback a lot from people who go, well, roasting kills the mold and the mycotoxin. It does not 100% according to studies. Does it lessen it? Yeah, for sure. Does it like irradiate it so there's no mold on your coffee beans? Nope, it does not. You have to be very careful. So if you are a heavy coffee drinker and you are not really particular about where your coffee comes from, and you struggle with mold or mold-like mycotoxin-like symptoms, evaluate your source of coffee and maybe reconsider looking. There are companies out there that test and claim to be mold and mycotoxin free. Just ask them for the certification, or view it, because it could be a real issue. Now, the same goes for phthalates and heavy metals and those prepackaged coffee products that a lot of people like to do. You have to be very careful, check up on your companies, read labels, ask for certification that it is mold-free, mycotoxin-free. They've been tested for heavy metals and toxins and things like that. Tea, I'm a tea drinker. I'm not a coffee drinker, but tea is just as guilty. Look at this in metals, average lead contamination in tea, all sorts of teas. And in fact, I think it was this study that said that you really, if you want to sort of minimize, if you have a tea and you don't actually know how healthy it is, organic doesn't count. Organic just means it wasn't sprayed. It doesn't mean that it's not pulling up metals and stuff from the soil. Then they said that you really shouldn't steep it for longer than 3 minutes. So you better believe if I have tea that I'm a little shady about, then I'm steeping it for under 3 minutes now, or trying not to drink it. This is average aluminum contamination in teas. You can see the study along the bottom if you want to pull it for yourself. It is a small study, but still, it's a concerning study. Viruses hijack the mitochondria and disrupt all over cell function, making it easier for a virus to control the cell and propagate. We don't want viruses to control the cell and propagate. That we don't like that. So definitely healthy functional mitochondria and immune system are really important for all viruses. Herpes virus, Epstein-Barr virus, the current virus, because of what they can do to the body. And this is a really good chapter, and it's free. It's a really good chapter in a book. I highly recommend it. I have the DOI listed there. You can pull it yourself. But the authors state, in recent years, due to the unavailability of antiviral drugs, researchers have proposed a number of new strategies to protect against free radical-induced oxidative stress. These strategies may be characterized as repair and protection. Protection is achieved by enzymes and by non-enzymatic compounds such as carotenoids, vitamin C, which humans don't make, vitamin E, glutathione, and flavonoids. And I think these particular compounds have come up a lot in 2020 for specific reasons. But please, I highly recommend pull this chapter and read about viruses and mitochondria. It's really fascinating. Medications. What medications cause this mitochondrial dysfunction? Statins are probably the most commonly known, but a lot of the cholesterol medications do. Beta blockers and ACE inhibitors, steroids such as hydrocortisone, dexamethasone, prednisone, NSAIDs, all of them. I think a lot of people knew that too. NSAIDs are pretty toxic to our mitochondria. All classes of psychotropic drugs, all classes. Antibiotics, fluoroquinolones are the big ones. Tamoxifen, metformin. Metformin causes obviously a lot of things, even like B12 deficiency, but mitochondrial dysfunction. HIV medications and epilepsy meds such as Depakote. So there's some pretty big ones on here that a lot of your patients are probably taken or have a history of taken. What helps your mitochondria? Here's some examples of cofactors that are important and can maybe be included in blends. CoQ10, lipoic acid, vitamin C again, selenium, B complexes, magnesium, zinc, manganese for that superoxide dismutase that's heavy in the mitochondria, copper, iron, which is needed in your mitochondria. I'll show you that in a second. Glutathione support, N-acetylcysteine is your big antioxidant, sulforaphane for your NRF2 upregulation, PQQ for that peroxynitrite, curcumin, because basically curcumin solves all world problems. EGCG from green tea, polyphenols, and then your mitochondria really like intermittent fasting, cold exposure, weightlifting, build those muscles, proper oxygenation, red and near infrared light therapy. So let's go through a few of these before we wrap up. So CoQ10, why is CoQ10 important? Now, should every single person be on CoQ10? Not necessarily, but I want you to know where in the mitochondria it fits in. It's an important carrier. It acts like a professional driver shuttling electrons. It's also an antioxidant, which is great. It recycles your E and your C, but E and C and other antioxidants help make CoQ10 more stable. So it works in tandem with your other antioxidants to make them go round, and recycle. It does help reduce inflammatory signaling. Ubiquinone or ubiquinol? That is the question, right? So just some facts. Most CoQ10 is ubiquinol, the reduced form. NQO1, which is quinone reductase. On the Dutch test, we talk a lot about quinone reductase as it relates to estrogen and proper estrogen metabolism, because this is on that naughty little quinone pathway. So NQO1, the enzyme, converts CoQ10 into ubiquinol. Your heart has the highest amount of CoQ10, followed by your liver, and then your kidneys. You need other, obviously, coenzymes, nutrients, supplements to make CoQ10. And the natural form is called all-trans isomer. Unfortunately, 60+% of CoQ10 supplements are excreted out. And in some research I read, it was like 90%. So quality counts. Get that all-trans isomer. If you want to eat it in foods, it's the grass-fed, grass-finished liver and heart muscle will give you your most bang for your buck on CoQ10. The dose on CoQ10 in research is huge. It's 50 to 1200 milligrams. I've even seen it up as high as 3000. Once we get in the 1200, 3000 range, that's absolutely in the Parkinson's disease research, which is pretty fascinating. And CoQ10 is lipophilic, therefore it is better absorbed with a fat. Where is your CoQ10? It's between complexes 1 and 3 and 3 and 2. That's where CoQ10 is. So it's a shuttler. Remember, it's electron shuttler. So it helps get that ball rolling. There's your NAD in complex 1, CoQ10. You've got, and then you move on to CoQ2 or complex 2. What about that red and near infrared light? There's red infrared, near infrared sunlight, right? Really popular, people talking about that in mitochondria. How does it work? Well, it turns out it's mitochondrial photostimulation, increases ATP production. Red and near infrared light can penetrate a few centimeters through the dermis of your skin, to the dermis of your skin. But how close you are to the light counts. If you just happen to have a red light on in your room, that's not going to get through. Like, you actually have to be up on that red light, within about 12 inches or less, depending on the therapy protocol, to make a dent for that red and that near infrared light. But how does it work? Well, when you get exposed to red and near infrared light, it binds onto cytochrome C oxidase. It's a photoacceptor. So not like binds, but it turns on, right? It's a photoacceptor. So that when cytochrome C oxidase can basically utilize oxygen better that's being made for to make ATP. So red light, near infrared comes in, cytochrome C oxidase is like, woohoo, red light, infrared light, fantastic, supercharges it basically, turns it on even more, and now you can better make ATP. Cytochrome C oxidase is heme dependent. So if you're anemic, iron anemic or low in iron, you're going to struggle with this section, this part right here. Red light also exercises hormesis. We know hormesis is important for building resiliency. So when you make ATP, all ATP, even when we're giving them CoQ10 and we're exposing them to red light, near infrared light, the sunlight, we increase our reactive oxygen species production. So this domino effect happens, our antioxidants rush in to reduce the inflammation, and now the mitochondria handle stress better, and it's more resilient, so they can continue the process. This isn't a healthy functioning mitochondria. This is why antioxidants are so important, but we need this little bit of hormesis all the time to strengthen up that mitochondria. Where is cytochrome C? It's between 3 and 4. You can see it up there between 3 and 4. So get your red and near infrared light exposure. NAD. So NAD and nicotinamide riboside. So nicotinamide riboside converts to NMN and then into NAD. There's another way to make NAD, but this is one way. It's a form of B12 combined with ribose, and it's the precursor, of course, to NAD. So several human studies have shown that 250 to 1,000 milligrams of nicotinamide riboside does increase NAD. And now what's popular is NMN. NMN in mouse and rat studies have been shown when they combine it with trimethylglycine, TMG is trimethylglycine, that also, it just eliminates, it's the middleman, right? So it just can go on to make NAD. And there are now supplement companies that have been making, have both nicotinamide riboside, but you'll also find NMN. Combined with trimethylglycine in it as well. Where is NAD? There's NAD. So it's part, the Krebs cycle makes NADH, but this is where the NAD part comes in. What about B12? So this is from the Dutch test. We want to look at that methylmalonate, that MMA. The higher your MMA, the more you need adenosine B12. So here, your B12 does two things in the body. Your methylcobalamin works with methylfolate to methylate homocysteine and convert it into methionine. That's what methylfolate does. It's the one thing it does. Your adenosylcobalamin takes methylmalonyl-CoA and helps convert it into succinyl-CoA, so it can enter the Krebs cycle. If it can't do that, if you don't have adenosine B12, then you back up and you form a lot more MMA. So the higher the MMA on your Dutch test, you specifically need adenosine B12 or hydroxy B12. Hydroxy can form either adenosine or methyl in the body. What about intermittent fasting? We're on the last couple of slides. Intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting does a lot of things. Of course, we're going to just touch on, a big one, which is mitochondrial biogenesis. So first and foremost, it reduces hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia, both of which cause mitochondrial dysfunction. It increases NRF2. NRF2 is a phase 2 sort of enzyme upregulator. So phase 2 detox enzyme upregulator, and it increases mitochondrial biogenesis. Intermittent fasting increases SIRT3. This is part of your sirtuin family. SIRT3 reduces reactive oxygen species. But let's talk about that mitochondrial biogenesis, because I think it's really kind of a super cool idea that your body does. You're a mitochondria, you have a couple options. You can go through mitophagy. So if you're like beyond the point of dysfunction, like you got to go. So a totally dysfunctional mitochondria is taken to the vacuole and then degraded. So autophagy, but in the mitochondria, it's mitophagy. It can be fission. Fission is where a mitochondria says, oh man, I've got pieces and parts of me that are broken or not that functional. I'm going to cut them out. I'm going to segment apart those bad pieces and let them float away and get picked up by, the immune system to get degraded. And then the healthy part of me is over here, and I can fuse with other mitochondria that are healthy and become bigger. So fission and fusion. I can fission off the stuff I don't like, so to speak, and I can fuse to become bigger or better. Bigger is biogenesis. So biogenesis is like this. I'm a mitochondria, and I am missing my right arm, and you're a mitochondria, and you're missing your left arm, and we see each other in the cell, and we're like, if we came together and smushed, we would have a functioning left and right arm, and we'd be bigger and better and bolder with two functioning arms, and that's biogenesis. So it's the act of self-renewal. It's the act of self-renewal, combining the best parts of pre-existing mitochondria. Increased by all those wonderful things there. Regular exercise, intermittent fasting, calorie restriction, cold temperatures like cold showers, cold plunges, cold swimming, sulforaphane broccoli sprouts, acetylcarnitine, beetroot, resveratrol, PQQ, tangerine, rhodiola, saffron, zeaxanthin, and metformin. Just be careful with metformin. The reason for metformin is because it reduces high glucose, which is damaging to mitochondrial biogenesis. But then metformin also damages mitochondria. So I put it on there because it's in the research, but just be careful. All right. Lastly, what inhibits that 11-beta-HSD2 enzyme? I said it right in the beginning, but I want to talk about it again just so we don't forget about this enzyme. If you have a deactivator, so all your system is making cortisol, but it's all getting deactivated, you want to address that long-term stress or illness. You want to support recovery from an acute illness. You want to support recovery from whatever they're recovering from, and then licorice. And the licorice specifically is with the glycyrrhiza. So DGL, deglycerized licorice, not going to work. DGL is mushy, and it's great for healing like ulcers and for heartburn and things like that. you actually need the glycyrrhiza in there if you want licorice to work for cortisol. And so you have to be careful if somebody, again, has potassium issues or high blood pressure, you may have to find a different route. So let's go back to that case really quick. She's in her 40s. She needs a lot of coffee. She has sleep apnea, but she doesn't use her machine, and she has a lot of, her antibodies are increasing and her symptoms are getting worse. So she is at increased risk of autoimmunity, like I said, because of that glucocorticoid induction of apoptosis of T cells. She's failing central tolerance, and she's failing the ability to activate that, that AIRE and kill off those cells. We also know because she is a flatter cortisol, she's at a higher risk for future blood sugar issues, because the rise in cortisol helps with the breakdown of glucose for especially in the morning when you wake fasting. But again, physiologic, we're looking for physiologic here. It helps reduce inflammation, but she's at risk for inflammation and recall and memory issues. If she were to ever develop cancer, God forbid, breast cancer, she's at earlier mortality rate risk as well. So for her, it's self-care, sleep quality, circadian rhythm optimization, everything we've talked about, blood sugar regulation, movement, hydration, and community. But most importantly for her, it's to use her sleep mask. She wasn't using her sleep mask. She wasn't getting the oxygenation up into her brain. That's affecting the way the brain can even do the car in the first place. So yeah, like all the, ashwagandha in the world might be helpful. But again, we have to go back to the reason. And the reason for her was she has sleep apnea and disordered breathing, and that's going to affect her brain function and the output of signaling and then how oxygen is used in the mitochondria. So if she does do supplements, brain, adrenal, mitochondrial support would be on waking, and then sleep support before bed. And you will just pick and choose off the slides what works for your patient. So in summary, cortisol signaling starts in the brain, production starts and ends in the mitochondria, and you need those heat shock proteins for proper protein folding, like in the glucocorticoid receptor. Don't be like the dysfunctional, thrown in the closet, folded, fitted sheet. Check that 11 beta HSD2 on the Dutch test. You want to see, are they a deactivator? Obviously, always address the cause and utilize light and dark therapy to your advantage. It sets and corrects the rhythm for your clock. Lastly, practitioner, please heal yourself this time, this day and age, the end of this year. Don't be like Cruella de Vil, trying to excel in your career, keep proper distance, maintain a social life, drink enough water, exercise, text everyone back, stay sane, survive, and be happy. I want your signaling and your mitochondrial health to be a game, because I can assure you her signaling and her mitochondrial health is not. So heal yourself, practitioner. If you are brand new to the Dutch test, never before sign up, and this is super exciting and intriguing to you, we have a special for you. So you can receive 50% off up to your first 5 kits when you sign up. You can email sales@dutchtest.com. You can call us directly. We are here 100% to support you, walk you through your first test, get you going, and get you all about your MMA and your cortisol and your metabolized cortisol and your melatonin and all these other markers that are important for autoimmunity, resilience, and more. So that concludes our talk. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I appreciate the round 2, and I am happy to answer questions if there are questions.
I've only got a few, Carrie, so I've got one as far as, do you have any suggestions for alternative medications for diabetics besides metformin that don't affect the mitochondria?
That's a great question. So diabetic medication is not my area of expertise. What you're going to have to do is whatever diabetic medication you choose to use, you're just going to have to look it up to see its effect on the mitochondria. And thankfully, this work is done for you. So all you have to do is type in the name of the medication. Let's say it's Byetta. Just type it, Google search or PubMed search Byetta mitochondria, and all this literature will show up. So they've a lot of like reference desk help has already looked it up. A lot of pharmacies have already looked it up for you, and so you can get it at your fingertips online. If you're using metformin as a what's the word I'm looking for, like a quick hit or a pinch hit, like they're not diabetic, but they're maybe a little insulin resistant, and you're putting them on metformin while you're addressing all these causes. Remember also like berberine. Berberine has been studied to be effective similarly to metformin. Look at also inositol, myo-inositol. and its help on insulin and insulin resistance. And so again, in that sort of like borderline patient that you're, maybe your go-to in the past was metformin, there are some great studied, researched supplements that may help just push them back into the normal range while you're addressing all the other stuff in their life.
Can you speak briefly about various forms of B12? Does methylcobalamin not effectively address B12 deficiency, high MMA?
So that's a wonderful question. The literature would tell you, you can take any form of B12, the body rips off the first name, it rips off the adenylyl, the methyl, the hydroxy, the cyano, leaves it as the cobalamin, and then takes the cobalamin and puts back on what it needs, either adenylyl or methyl. You only have two active forms in your body, adenylyl and methyl. That's it. Cyano is fake, it's synthetic, but it does turn into methyl or adenylyl, but you have to make cyanide a little bit of cyanide in the process. So not a fan of that. And then hydroxy, which is natural, can convert into either of them. So again, literature says, doesn't matter what you give, you're going to tear off the first name, leave the cobalamin, and then convert it. Anecdotally, working for a lab that does thousands and thousands and thousands of methylmalonic acids all the time, and having a team of 10, there are 10 doctors that work at Dutch Test, we see over and over and over and over and over and over again that methylcobalamin does not often move the meter on MMA, that you actually have to do hydroxy or adenylyl. I don't know why. I don't know if it's because humans are at a mad need for methyl B12 and that's the priority. When you give methyl, it just sort of influences methyl. But we see over and over and over again, and we hear from other people like, wow, I've had to give both. I had to give adenylyl and methyl B12. I had to give hydroxy and adenylyl and methyl, or I had to give hydroxy. I just give hydroxy. That's what I give because the body can let it decide. So literature says I'm wrong, but years of experience and thousands of tests and a lot of feedback tell me that this specific form does matter. That methyl will not necessarily replete that adenylyl. And again, remember adenylyl, so I don't mean to cut you off, Amy. Adenylyl and methyl do two different things in the body. One is strictly Krebs cycle and one is strictly homocysteine to methionine. They stay in their lane.
Sure. So how much darkness do you recommend for reset or essentially, when making things dark at night?
So honestly, I think it depends on the person. Some people their head hits the pillow and they're out. They could probably sleep through a concert if they had to. Other people find, they're like, and they have to try it.
Reset.
Yep, they have to like wear a sleep mask and get the blue or get the what's the word I'm looking for? Those curtains. Get the blackout curtains. They have to cover up any light in their body or in their room. Well, I hope there's no light in their body. And then they find like, okay, when I'm in a cave, when I'm in a completely black cave, that darkness is what I need to help me with sleep. And other people can have a happy medium. They're like, well, like I can see down the hall, if my kid has their light on, I can still fall asleep. Like my room's dark enough. And so it really depends on the person. If they're very dysfunctional, then I advocate for complete darkness, like really like force that reset. And then once they are more trained with their sleep, then I feel like they can be a little more flexible. Like if they're traveling or, not that anyone travels anymore, but if they're doing something where the light comes on, it may not affect them as much. But at night, it's the same sleep hygiene. You want to wind down at night. You want those blue light blocking glasses on at night. You don't want to have every single light on in the whole house because it's, getting dark out. So you want every light. You don't want that. You want to really start to match what's happening outside, like gradually start to wind down. Which I know it's hard because here where Amy and I live in Portland, Oregon, it gets dark at 4:35. Sunsets at 4:35, which is awesome.
Right.
We're over it. And it just started. Yeah. Yes, there's a hilarious cartoon of a woman she's freaking out to her husband. What time is it? What time is it? It's got to be midnight. He's like, it's 6:30. I'm like, yeah, that's how we feel.
So that was our last question. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this encore presentation. Thank you, Dr. Jones. And once again, everybody, we will be sending the recording, barring no technical difficulties, and along with the slides, copy of the slides. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.